The courtroom was silent, except for the soft rustling of papers and the nervous breathing of 200 people packed into the gallery. Judge Lorraine Adams sat behind the bench, her hands folded on the dark wood surface, her face carefully composed into the neutral mask she had perfected over 23 years on the federal bench. She was 55 years old at the peak of her career. Her reputation was formidable. Lawyers called her Iron Adams behind her back. Fair but uncompromising, brilliant but intimidating. She had presided over some of the most significant cases in the Ninth Circuit: corporate fraud, organized crime, civil rights violations. She had sent white-collar criminals to prison and set innocent people free. She believed in the law with a passion that bordered on religious faith. Today, that faith would be tested like never before. Senator Marcus Webb sat at the defense table, perfectly groomed in a $5,000 suit. His silver hair swept back, his face arranged in an expression of wounded dignity. He looked like a man who had been wronged, not a man who had stolen $20 million in federal grants meant for veterans' hospitals and housing programs. Lorraine had reviewed the evidence 3 times. The paper trail was clear. Webb's nonprofit foundation had received government funds, then funneled the money through shell corporations to Webb's private accounts. The FBI had wiretaps. They had emails. They had testimony from Webb's accountant, who had been granted immunity. It should have been a straightforward case. Guilty. 5 to 7 years in federal prison. But nothing involving Senator Marcus Webb was ever straightforward. The pressure had started 6 weeks ago during pre-trial motions. First, there were the phone calls. Nothing explicit, just senators from the Judiciary Committee checking in on her, asking about her caseload, mentioning upcoming appointments to appellate courts. Lorraine had been on the short list for the Court of Appeals for years. Everyone knew it. Then came the visits. The Deputy Attorney General, ostensibly discussing court administration, but somehow the conversation always circled back to Webb's case, to the complexity of prosecuting elected officials, to the national interest in maintaining stability. "We're not asking you to do anything improper," the Deputy AG had said carefully. "We're just hoping you'll consider all the factors. The political ramifications, the precedent." Lorraine had shown him the door, but the pressure didn't stop. It intensified. Her clerk received death threats. Her daughter's car was vandalized. Someone left a dead rat on her doorstep. When she reported these incidents, the investigation moved at a glacial pace. And then, 3 days ago, she had received the memo. It came through official channels, buried in a routine administrative update. New procedural requirements for cases involving elected officials, issued by the chief judge under pressure from the administrative office of the courts. The requirements were technical, almost incomprehensible, but Lorraine understood their purpose immediately. They created a loophole, a way to dismiss the case on procedural grounds. She had called the chief judge. "You can't be serious about this." "I didn't have a choice, Lorraine. The order came from Washington." "This is wrong." "I know. But if you don't follow it, they'll overturn you on appeal anyway, and they'll remove you from the bench. Judicial misconduct. Failure to follow administrative procedures. They have the power to do it." Lorraine had spent that night reading the law, searching for another way. But the memo was airtight. If she ignored it, Webb would win on appeal, and she would be destroyed. If she followed it, Webb would go free, but at least she would still be a judge. She could still do good in other cases. It was, she realized with growing horror, a perfect trap. Now, sitting in her courtroom on this gray March morning, she had to make her choice. The prosecutor finished his closing argument. It was powerful, devastating. He laid out the evidence piece by piece, building an irrefutable case. When he sat down, there was a murmur of satisfaction from the gallery. Justice would be done. The defense attorney stood. He was smooth, expensive, one of the best in the country, but even he couldn't argue with the facts. Instead, he talked about procedure, about the new administrative requirements, about how the prosecution had technically failed to comply with subsection 4B3 of the memo. It was nonsense. Everyone in the room knew it was nonsense, but it was technically correct. When the attorney sat down, all eyes turned to Lorraine. She looked at the prosecutor's face. He was young, idealistic, working for a government salary because he believed in justice. She saw the confidence in his eyes. He had no idea what was coming. She looked at the FBI agents in the gallery. They had worked for 2 years to build this case. She looked at the victims, the veterans who had been promised housing and received nothing, the families who had been betrayed by a man they trusted. Then she looked at Senator Webb. For just a moment, their eyes met. He smiled. It was a small smile, barely noticeable, but Lorraine saw the triumph in it. He knew he had won. She took a deep breath. "This court has reviewed the evidence and the arguments presented by both sides," she began, her voice steady and clear. "The evidence of wrongdoing is substantial and, under normal circumstances, would clearly support a conviction." She paused. The courtroom was absolutely silent. "However, this court is bound by the administrative procedures governing cases of this nature. The prosecution, despite its thorough work, has failed to comply with the requirements set forth in Administrative Memorandum 2024-15, subsection 4B3, which requires specific filing procedures for cases involving elected federal officials." The prosecutor stood up. "Your Honor, that memo was issued after we filed—" "Sit down, counsel," Lorraine said quietly. "I have not finished." He sat, his face pale with disbelief. "While this court finds the timing and application of this administrative requirement to be highly questionable, and while this court believes the evidence clearly demonstrates the defendant's guilt, I am constrained by the law to follow proper procedure. The case is dismissed on procedural grounds without prejudice. The government may refile if it chooses to comply with the administrative requirements." Chaos erupted in the courtroom. The prosecutor stood, shouting objections. The victims began to cry. The press surged forward. The bailiffs struggled to maintain order. Senator Webb stood, straightened his tie, and walked toward the exit. As he passed Lorraine's bench, he nodded to her. Just once. Lorraine sat frozen, listening to the sounds of anguish and anger around her. She had just set a guilty man free. She had followed the law, followed procedure, done everything correctly. And she had betrayed everything she believed in. That night, alone in her chambers, Lorraine Adams wrote her letter of resignation. She couldn't be part of this system anymore. She couldn't sit on a bench and call it justice when she knew it was anything but. She had spent 23 years believing that the law was sacred, that it protected the weak and punished the powerful. Today, she learned that the law could be twisted, manipulated, used as a weapon to protect the guilty. She finished the letter, signed it, and sealed it in an envelope. Tomorrow, she would submit it to the chief judge. But tonight, she would grieve for the career she was leaving behind and for the faith she had lost. Lorraine's resignation made headlines for a week. "Federal judge resigns after controversial dismissal," read the Times. "Justice or politics? Adams steps down," proclaimed the Post. Legal analysts debated her decision on cable news. Some called her principled. Others called her a coward for not fighting the system. Lorraine didn't watch the coverage. She packed up her chambers, said goodbye to her staff, and disappeared from public life. The first month was the worst. She couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Senator Webb's smug smile, heard the crying of the victims in the courtroom. She had nightmares about standing at her bench, frozen, unable to speak the words that would set things right. Her daughter Emma visited every weekend. "Mom, you did what you had to do. You were trapped. I could have refused. I could have ignored the memo and forced them to overturn me on appeal. And Webb would still be free. And you would have lost everything. At least this way, you controlled your own exit." But Lorraine didn't feel like she had controlled anything. She felt like a puppet whose strings had been cut. She tried to stay in Washington, D.C., where she had lived for 30 years, but everywhere she went, people recognized her. Former colleagues avoided her at the grocery store, unsure of what to say. Lawyers she had known for decades crossed the street to avoid awkward conversations. Worse were the ones who approached her. Some wanted to sympathize, others wanted to criticize. All of them wanted to talk about the case, to rehash the decision, to hear her justify or condemn herself. She couldn't do it. She couldn't keep explaining, couldn't keep defending, couldn't keep reliving that terrible morning in court. 6 months after her resignation, Lorraine made a decision. She would leave Washington entirely. Start over somewhere new, somewhere no one knew Judge Adams. She spent weeks researching small towns on the West Coast. She didn't want a city. Too many lawyers. Too much politics. She didn't want complete isolation. She still needed human connection. She wanted something in between. A place where she could be anonymous, ordinary, forgotten. She found Misty Vale on a rainy afternoon in October, scrolling through listings on her laptop. The town was on the Oregon coast, population 3,200. It had one main street, a few shops, a diner, a library. The photographs showed weathered wooden buildings, fishing boats bobbing in a small harbor, and fog rolling in off the Pacific Ocean. It looked gray and quiet and far away from everything. Perfect. Lorraine bought a plane ticket and flew out for a visit. She rented a car in Portland and drove 3 hours west through mountains and forests until she reached the coast. When she crested the final hill and saw Misty Vale spread out below her, surrounded by pine trees on 3 sides and the ocean on the 4th, she felt something shift in her chest. It wasn't quite hope, but it was close. She spent 3 days walking around the town, talking to locals, getting a feel for the place. Everyone was friendly in that cautious small-town way. They were curious about the well-dressed woman from out of town, but too polite to ask too many questions. On her last day, Lorraine walked into a small bookstore on Main Street. It was called the Reading Nook, and it was everything a bookstore should be. Cozy, cluttered, smelling of old paper and coffee. An elderly woman sat behind the counter, reading glasses perched on her nose, working on a crossword puzzle. "Can I help you?" she asked, looking up. "Just browsing," Lorraine said. But as she wandered through the narrow aisles, running her fingers along the spines of used books, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Calm. She picked up a mystery novel, paid for it, and was about to leave when she saw the sign in the window. "For sale." "You're selling the shop?" she asked the woman. "Afraid so. I'm 83 and my arthritis is getting worse. Time to retire." Lorraine stared at the sign. It was an insane idea. She knew nothing about running a bookstore. She had spent her entire adult life in courtrooms and law libraries, not retail shops. But standing there, surrounded by books, far from Washington and politics and Senator Marcus Webb, she felt a pull she couldn't explain. "How much?" she asked. 3 weeks later, Lorraine Adams became the new owner of the Reading Nook. She bought a small house 2 blocks from the store, a weather-beaten cottage with a view of the ocean. She packed up her life in Washington, putting her legal books in storage and taking only the things that mattered. Photographs of Emma, her mother's quilt, her favorite coffee mug. When people in Misty Vale asked about her background, she kept it vague. I worked for the government in D.C., needed a change. No one pushed for details. Small towns respected privacy, especially for people who clearly wanted a fresh start. Lorraine threw herself into learning the bookstore business. She organized the inventory, updated the accounting system, created a website. She started a weekly book club that met in the back room on Tuesday evenings. She learned the names of her regular customers, remembered their favorite genres, ordered special books for them. She kept her routine simple. Open the store at 9, work until 6, go home, read, sleep. On weekends, she walked along the beach, collecting shells and watching the waves. She stopped wearing the severe suits she had worn as a judge, replacing them with comfortable jeans, sweaters, and rain jackets. She let her hair, which she had always kept in a tight bun, grow longer and softer. Slowly, painfully, she began to feel human again. The nightmares didn't stop, but they became less frequent. She still thought about Senator Webb, about the case, about the victims. But the crushing weight of guilt became something she could carry, if not forget. She made friends. There was Margaret Chen, who ran the coffee shop next door and brought her lattes every morning. There was Frank Kowalski, the retired fisherman who came in every Thursday to browse the history section and tell her stories about his years at sea. There was Sarah Winters, the young librarian who shared Lorraine's love of mystery novels. None of them knew about her past. To them, she was just Lorraine, the quiet, kind woman who ran the bookstore. And slowly, that's who she became. 1 year became 2, 2 became 5, 5 became 10. Lorraine Adams, former federal judge, faded away. In her place was Lorraine, the bookstore owner, a fixture of Misty Vale, loved by the community for her gentle wisdom and generous heart. She thought she had escaped her past. She thought she had found peace. She was wrong. 12 years after leaving Washington, D.C., Lorraine Adams sat in her usual spot behind the counter of the reading nook, reading glasses perched on her nose, working through a new mystery novel. At 67, she had settled into a comfortable routine that felt as natural as breathing. The morning fog had just lifted, revealing a crisp October day. Through the bookstore's front window, Lorraine could see Main Street coming to life. Margaret was opening the coffee shop, hanging out the open sign and waving to Lorraine through the window. Across the street, Tom Fisher was setting up the outdoor display at his hardware store. Further down, Emily Rodriguez was unlocking the door to her art gallery. It was Tuesday, which meant book club tonight. Lorraine glanced at the stack of books on the counter. 10 copies of The Remains of the Day, this month's selection. The group had grown over the years. What started with 5 people now regularly attracted 15 or 20. They had worked their way through classics, contemporary fiction, mysteries, and even some poetry. Lorraine loved facilitating the discussions, watching people discover new perspectives, listening to them debate interpretations. The bell above the door chimed. Sarah Winters rushed in, raincoat dripping, her arms full of library books. Morning, Lorraine. Sorry I'm late returning these. No problem at all. How's everything at the library? Sarah set the books on the counter and sighed. Busy. We're doing a literacy program for kids after school, and enrollment is way up, which is wonderful, but we're stretched thin. You need volunteers? Lorraine asked. I could spare a few hours on Saturday mornings. Really? That would be amazing. The kids would love you. You're so patient with the young readers who come in here. They chatted for a few more minutes about books and library programs before Sarah hurried off to work. Lorraine shelved the returned books, then settled back into her novel. The morning passed peacefully. A few customers came and went. Mrs. Patterson bought 3 romance novels for her beach house. Young Jamie Rodriguez, Emily's son, traded in some comic books for store credit and left with a fantasy novel. Frank Kowalski stopped by to browse, as he did every week, and they talked about the upcoming storm season. Around 11, Margaret brought over coffee and a blueberry muffin. "Slow morning?" Margaret asked, perching on the stool next to the counter. "Just how I like it," Lorraine said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "You're coming to the town council meeting tomorrow night, right?" Lorraine made a face. "Do I have to?" "They're voting on the new parking regulations. It affects all the Main Street businesses." "What's the controversy this time?" Margaret launched into a detailed explanation of the parking dispute. Something about angled parking versus parallel parking, meters versus no meters, tourist access versus resident access. It was exactly the kind of small-town issue that used to seem trivial to Lorraine in her Washington days, but now felt important because it affected people she cared about. "I'll be there," she promised. After Margaret left, Lorraine returned to her book, but she found her mind wandering. She looked around the bookstore, at the shelves she had organized over the years, at the comfortable reading chairs by the window, at the bulletin board covered with announcements for local events. This place had saved her life. Not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly, steadily, day by day. It had given her purpose when she thought she had none. It had given her community when she felt alone. It had given her a new identity when her old one had become unbearable. She was happy here. Not in the ambitious, driven way she had been happy as a judge, always reaching for the next challenge, the next case, the next promotion, but in a quieter, deeper way. Content. The nightmares about Senator Webb and the courtroom had stopped years ago. She still thought about that day sometimes, but the memories had lost their sharp edges. The guilt was still there, but it had become part of her, integrated rather than overwhelming. She had learned to forgive herself, mostly. She understood now that she had been in an impossible situation, that she had done what she thought was right at the time, even if it felt wrong. She couldn't change the past. She could only live her life now with integrity and kindness. The afternoon brought more customers. Tourist season was winding down, but there were still a few visitors exploring the coast. Lorraine helped a couple from Seattle find local history books. She recommended a novel to a woman who was looking for something literary, but not depressing. She ordered a special book for old Mr. Henderson, who collected first editions of Hemingway. At 5:30, as she was preparing to close for the day, the bell chimed again. A man walked in, someone Lorraine didn't recognize. He was in his early 40s, wearing an expensive suit that looked out of place in Misty Vale. City clothes. His eyes scanned the bookstore quickly, efficiently, taking in every detail. "Can I help you?" Lorraine asked, feeling a small prickle of unease. "Just looking," he said, his voice smooth and professional. He moved through the store, picking up books randomly, not really looking at them. His attention seemed to be on the layout of the space, the doors, the windows. Lorraine watched him carefully, her old judge's instincts activating. Something felt off. This wasn't a tourist. This wasn't a book lover. This was someone who was here for a different reason. After about 5 minutes, the man approached the counter. He pulled out a business card and handed it to her. "I'm looking for property in the area," he said. "Investment opportunities. If you're ever interested in selling, give me a call." Lorraine glanced at the card. Coastal Development, LLC. No name, just a phone number. "I'm not interested in selling," she said firmly. "Think about it." "I'm prepared to offer well above market value." "I said I'm not interested." The man studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Fair enough. You have a nice evening, ma'am." He left. Lorraine stood behind the counter, staring at the business card. The unease she had felt intensified. Something about that interaction was wrong. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the feeling. Maybe she was being paranoid. Maybe he was just what he claimed to be, an investor looking for property. But as she locked up the store and walked home through the evening mist, Lorraine couldn't shake the feeling that something in Misty Vale was not quite right. And her old instincts, the ones she had honed over 23 years on the federal bench, were telling her to pay attention. The next morning, Lorraine arrived at the reading nook to find the front window cracked. Not shattered, just a clean crack running diagonally across the glass, as if something had struck it during the night. She examined the damage carefully. There was no obvious point of impact, no rock or debris nearby. The crack looked almost deliberate, like someone had used a tool to score the glass. "Vandalism?" Margaret asked, coming over from the coffee shop. "That's so unlike this town." "I don't know what happened," Lorraine said. "I'll call someone to fix it." But as she swept up the small fragments of glass that had fallen inside, she thought about the man from yesterday, the one with the business card and the expensive suit. Coincidence? She called the sheriff's office. 20 minutes later, Sheriff Tom Drake arrived. He was a big man, mid-50s, with a friendly face and a slow, easy manner that inspired trust. He had been sheriff for 15 years, and everyone in Misty Vale respected him. "Morning, Lorraine," he said, examining the crack. "Probably just thermal stress. These old windows, they expand and contract with temperature changes. Sometimes they crack. In the middle of the night, it happens." He shrugged. "I'll file a report, but honestly, I wouldn't worry about it. If it was vandalism, we'd see more damage." After he left, Lorraine stood in the bookstore, looking at the cracked window. Sheriff Drake's explanation made sense, technically. But something about his dismissiveness bothered her. She thought about the man yesterday. Then she thought about other small things she had noticed over the past few months. Things that individually seemed insignificant but together formed a pattern. There were the Tuesday night visitors. For the past 3 months, 4 men had been coming to her book club meetings. They always sat in the back, rarely participated in discussions, and left quickly at the end. When Lorraine tried to engage them in conversation, they were polite but vague. They claimed to be interested in literature, but she never saw them reading. There were the young people. Misty Vale, like most small coastal towns, had trouble keeping young people. They moved to cities for jobs and opportunities. But lately, Lorraine had noticed several new young faces around town. They came and went, staying for a few weeks or months before disappearing. They worked odd jobs, fishing boats, construction, restaurant work. But there was something off about them. They seemed nervous, distracted, always looking over their shoulders. There were the business owners. Several shops on Main Street had changed hands in the past year. The old bakery was now owned by someone from out of town. The tackle shop had a new owner. Even the diner had been sold. The new owners seemed competent, but they weren't local. They kept to themselves, didn't participate in community events the way the old owners had. And then there were the meetings. Several times over the past few months, Lorraine had noticed small groups of men meeting in odd places. In cars parked at the edge of town, in the corner booth at the diner late at night, on the dock after the fishing boats had come in. The meetings were brief, always just 2 or 3 people, and the participants seemed anxious to avoid attention. Individually, none of these things meant anything. New people moved to town, businesses changed hands, people had private meetings. It was normal. But Lorraine's instincts, the same instincts that had made her a successful judge, were telling her that something was wrong. There was a pattern here. She just couldn't see it yet. She spent the rest of the day distracted, helping customers, but not really present. That evening's book club meeting made her more uneasy. The four regular suspicious attendees were there again, sitting in the back row. Lorraine paid closer attention to them than usual. They were all men, ages ranging from early 30s to mid-50s. One of them, a thin man with dark hair and nervous eyes, checked his watch repeatedly. Another kept glancing at the door. A third spent more time looking at the other book club members than at the discussion. When the meeting ended, Lorraine made a point of approaching them. "I don't think I've properly introduced myself," she said, extending her hand to the nervous one. "I'm Lorraine Adams. I don't believe I caught your names." "Rick," he said, shaking her hand briefly. "Rick Miller." "And what brings you to our book club, Rick?" "I like to read," he said vaguely. "What do you do here in Misty Vale?" "Construction, working on a project outside town. How are you finding the remains of the day?" "It's good. Very British." Lorraine tried to engage him in actual discussion about the book, but it became immediately clear that Rick Miller had not read a single page. He made vague comments about the butler and the old house, but couldn't recall any specific scenes or themes. The other three were similarly evasive. They gave first names only: David, Tom, and Carl. They claimed to work in various manual labor jobs. They deflected any real conversation about the books. After they left, Sarah Winters helped Lorraine clean up the chairs and collect the coffee cups. "Those guys are weird," Sarah said. "Why do they keep coming if they're not interested in books?" "I was wondering the same thing," Lorraine said. "Maybe they're just lonely? Looking for social connection? Maybe." But Lorraine didn't think that was it. People who wanted social connection participated in conversations. They asked questions. They shared opinions. These men were observing, not participating. Why? That night, Lorraine couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, listening to the sound of waves crashing on the shore, thinking about patterns and coincidences. She had spent 23 years examining evidence, looking for connections, building cases. She knew the difference between random events and organized activity. What she was seeing in Misty Vale looked like organized activity. But to what end? She got out of bed, went to her small home office, and opened her laptop. She created a new document and started writing down everything she had noticed over the past few months. Every strange visitor, every new business owner, every odd meeting. When she finished, it was 3 a.m, and she had filled 5 pages with notes. She read through them again, looking for patterns, connections, and slowly, reluctantly, a picture began to form. It looked like something she had seen before, in her years on the federal bench. It looked like the early stages of organized crime establishing a foothold in a new territory. No, she thought. That's crazy. This is Misty Vale, a tiny coastal town. Why would organized crime care about this place? But she had learned long ago to trust her instincts. Something was wrong in Misty Vale. And Lorraine Adams, who had fled her past to find peace, was going to find out what it was. Lorraine decided that if she was going to investigate her suspicions, she needed to be methodical. She couldn't just react to individual incidents. She needed to gather evidence, establish patterns, and build a case, the same way she would have approached a complex trial. The next morning, she started a notebook. On the first page, she wrote, "Observations, Misty Vale, October 2024. Every day, she documented anything unusual. She noted the times and locations of suspicious meetings. She recorded the names of new arrivals in town and tried to find out where they worked and where they lived. She paid attention to the flow of money. Which businesses seemed unusually prosperous? Which ones seemed to be struggling despite good foot traffic? She was careful to maintain her normal routine. She opened the bookstore every morning at 9. She chatted with customers. She attended town events. She didn't want anyone to know she was watching. The book club became her primary source of information. People talked freely at book club meetings, especially before and after the formal discussion. They gossiped about their neighbors, complained about local politics, shared news about new businesses and new people. Lorraine listened to everything. Within 2 weeks, her notebook was filling up with information. Rick Miller, one of the suspicious book club members, was living at the seaside motel on the edge of town. He paid in cash weekly. 3 new fishing boats had been registered in Misty Vale over the past 6 months. None of them seemed to actually fish. They went out at odd hours and returned quickly. Mayor Carl Morrison had recently purchased an expensive new truck, well beyond what a small-town mayor's salary would support. Several local business owners seemed unusually nervous. Frank Kowalski, her friend from the bookstore, had mentioned that fishermen were being pressured to cooperate with the new boat owners, though he was vague about what that meant. The more Lorraine learned, the more concerned she became. The patterns she was seeing suggested something serious, possibly drug trafficking, possibly money laundering, possibly both. She needed more concrete evidence, and she needed it without exposing herself. One evening in late October, Lorraine stayed late at the bookstore. She had told Margaret she was doing inventory, which wasn't entirely untrue, but her real purpose was to watch the diner across the street. She had noticed that every Wednesday night around 10 p.m., 3 specific people met in the back booth of the diner: Mayor Morrison, Sheriff Drake, and a man named Vincent Costa, who owned one of the new fishing boats. At 9:45, Lorraine turned off most of the lights in the bookstore and positioned herself by the window, where she had a clear view of the diner. She had brought binoculars, ostensibly for birdwatching, a common hobby in coastal Oregon. At exactly 10 p.m., Mayor Morrison arrived. 5 minutes later, Sheriff Drake pulled up in his personal car, not his patrol vehicle. At 10:10, Vincent Costa walked in. Through the diner window, Lorraine watched them meet. They sat in the back booth, the one that wasn't visible from the street. Their body language was tense. Costa pulled out a manila envelope and slid it across the table. Morrison opened it, looked inside, and nodded. He said something to Costa, who nodded back. Then Drake leaned in, and the 3 men talked for several minutes, their faces serious. The meeting lasted exactly 15 minutes. Costa left first. Morrison and Drake sat together for another 5 minutes, then departed separately. Lorraine photographed their license plates with her phone. It wasn't much, but it was something. She continued her surveillance over the next few weeks. The Wednesday night meetings were regular. Different people sometimes joined. The owners of new businesses, the men from book club, and others Lorraine didn't recognize. But Morrison, Drake, and Costa were always there. In early November, Lorraine made a disturbing discovery. She was in the back room of the bookstore, organizing stock, when she heard voices outside the rear door. The door opened onto an alley that ran behind the Main Street businesses. Normally, it was quiet back there. She moved closer to the door and listened. 2 men were talking, their voices low and urgent. "Told you to handle it. Tried, but he won't cooperate. Costa wants this resolved by Friday. What if he goes to the state police? Won't be a problem." Lorraine carefully opened the door a crack and peered out. She recognized one of the men, Rick Miller from book club. The other was younger, maybe 25, someone she had seen around town but didn't know. "Look," Rick was saying, "I don't like this any more than you do. But we have our orders. Frank either cooperates or he faces consequences." Frank. They were talking about Frank Kowalski, her friend, the retired fisherman. What kind of consequences? The younger man asked nervously. The kind that make people cooperate real fast? They walked away, their voices fading. Lorraine stood in the back room, her heart pounding. Frank was in danger. Whatever was happening in Misty Vale, it was escalating from suspicious activity to threats of violence. She had to do something. But what? She couldn't go to the police. Sheriff Drake was clearly involved. She couldn't go to the mayor. He was at the center of it. And she couldn't confront these people directly without putting herself at risk. For the first time since leaving Washington, Lorraine felt the old fire ignite in her chest. The same fire that had driven her to become a prosecutor, then a judge. The need to see justice done, to protect the innocent, to hold the guilty accountable. She had failed in Senator Webb's case. She had been trapped, manipulated, forced to let a guilty man go free. She wouldn't fail again. That night, Lorraine added a new section to her notebook. Witness Protection Plan. If she was going to expose whatever criminal enterprise was operating in Misty Vale, she needed to make sure the innocent people like Frank, were protected. She also added another section. External contacts. She couldn't solve this alone. Eventually, she would need to bring in law enforcement from outside Misty Vale. But she had to be careful about who she contacted. If she went to the wrong people, word might get back to Morrison and Drake. She thought about her old contacts in federal law enforcement. She had worked with FBI agents, DEA investigators, U.S. Marshals. Some of them might still remember her. Some might be willing to help. But first, she needed more evidence. Suspicions and patterns weren't enough. She needed proof of crimes, documents, photographs, recordings. The kind of evidence that would stand up in court. The kind of evidence that could take down everyone involved. Lorraine looked at herself in the mirror that night. At 67, she looked like a harmless bookstore owner. Gray hair, comfortable clothes, reading glasses. She looked like someone who spent her days recommending novels and organizing book clubs. No one would suspect that she was planning to investigate and expose a criminal conspiracy, which, she realized, was her greatest advantage. She had been invisible for 12 years. She would use that invisibility as a weapon. Judge Lorraine Adams might be retired, but her sense of justice had never gone away. It had just been waiting for the right case. And this, she thought grimly, was definitely the right case. Frank Kowalski didn't come to the bookstore the following Thursday. Lorraine waited all day, but he never showed up. On Friday, she casually mentioned to Margaret that she hadn't seen Frank. "Oh, you didn't hear?" Margaret said, her face troubled. "He had an accident on his boat. Fell and broke his arm pretty badly." "What?" "When?" "Wednesday night. He was working on something, slipped, fell hard. Doctor says he'll be okay, but he's pretty shaken up." Wednesday night. The same night, Rick Miller and his associate had been talking about consequences for Frank. Lorraine felt a chill run through her. "Which hospital?" she asked. "He's home now. Lives on Coastal Road, the blue house with the white trim." That afternoon, Lorraine closed the bookstore early and drove to Frank's house. She brought a casserole, the universal small-town excuse for visiting someone who was ill or injured. Frank answered the door with his left arm, his right arm in a cast and a sling. "Lorraine!" "You didn't have to." "Of course I did. Let me put this in your kitchen." She followed him inside. The house was modest but comfortable, filled with photographs of Frank's years at sea and his late wife. Lorraine set the casserole on the counter. "How did this happen, Frank?" she asked gently. He avoided her eyes. "Stupid accident. I was checking the lines on my old boat, slipped on some wet deck. Happens to old fools like me." Lorraine looked at him carefully. Frank was 72, but he had spent 50 years on fishing boats. He didn't slip on wet decks. "Frank," she said quietly, "you can tell me the truth. What really happened?" For a moment she thought he would maintain the lie, but then his shoulders sagged. "Someone came to see me. Wednesday night. 2 men. They wanted me to help them use my boat, transport things. I said no. They got angry. One of them grabbed me, twisted my arm. I tried to fight back, but..." He gestured helplessly with his casted arm. "They said if I told anyone, it would be worse next time." Lorraine felt rage building in her chest, but she kept her voice calm. "Did you recognize them?" "One of them was that Rick fellow. Comes to your book club sometimes. The other one was younger. I didn't know him." "Have you told anyone else?" "The sheriff?" Frank laughed bitterly. "Tom Drake?" "He's part of it, Lorraine. He won't help. Nobody will help." "What do you mean he's part of it?" Frank sat down heavily at his kitchen table. "There's something bad happening in this town. Has been for about a year now. I don't know all the details, but I know the mayor and the sheriff are involved. They're bringing in drugs, I think. Using the fishing boats to move them. They've been pressuring the old-time fishermen to cooperate. Most of us said no at first, but..." He gestured at his broken arm. "They have ways of convincing people." "How many others have been threatened?" "At least 4 or 5 that I know of. We don't talk about it openly. Too scared." Lorraine pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "Frank, I need you to trust me. I'm going to help you. But I need information. Everything you know about what's happening." "Lorraine, you're a bookstore owner. What can you..." "I wasn't always a bookstore owner," she said quietly. "I used to work in law enforcement. I know how to handle situations like this. But I need your help." Frank studied her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he began to talk. Over the next hour, Lorraine learned the full scope of what was happening in Misty Vale. The criminal organization had moved in about 18 months ago, quietly and systematically. They started by buying up businesses, legitimate fronts for money laundering. They recruited the mayor and sheriff by offering them money and, when that didn't work, by threatening their families. They brought in outside workers, young people, often with addiction problems or criminal records, people who were desperate and easy to control. They used them as couriers, laborers, and enforcers. The core business was drug trafficking. They brought shipments in from larger operations in California and distributed them throughout rural Oregon and Northern California. The fishing boats provided the transportation. The new businesses provided the money laundering infrastructure. Anyone who resisted was threatened, beaten, or forced out of town. Several longtime residents had suddenly decided to move after receiving visits from the organization's enforcers. "Why hasn't anyone gone to the state police?" Lorraine asked. "A few people tried." The state police came out, talked to Sheriff Drake, and went away satisfied. Drake's good at covering things up. He files false reports, intimidates potential witnesses, makes sure nothing looks unusual from the outside. "What about the FBI?" Frank shrugged. "Who's going to call them?" "Most people here are too scared. And honestly, most of us didn't realize how big this was until it was too late. It started small. Just some odd things, some new people. By the time we understood what was happening, they had the town sewn up tight." After leaving Frank's house, Lorraine drove to the beach and parked. She sat in her car, watching the waves crash against the rocks, thinking. This was bigger than she had realized. It wasn't just suspicious activity or small-time crime. This was organized crime, sophisticated, violent, and deeply embedded in the community. She thought about calling the FBI right away. But Frank was right. They would probably contact the local sheriff first, and that would alert the organization. Everyone who had helped her, including Frank, would be at risk. No, She needed to build an ironclad case first. She needed evidence that was so overwhelming, so comprehensive, that when she brought it to federal law enforcement, they would have no choice but to act immediately and decisively. She needed to do what she did best: build a case. Over the next several days, Lorraine transformed the back room of her bookstore into a makeshift investigation headquarters. She brought in a filing cabinet from home, installed a lock on the back room door, and started organizing evidence. She created files for each person of interest: Mayor Morrison, Sheriff Drake, Vincent Costa, Rick Miller, and others she identified as being involved. For each person, she documented their activities, associations, and any suspicious behaviors. She started taking photographs. She bought a better camera with a telephoto lens, again, ostensibly for birdwatching, and documented the Wednesday night meetings, the movement of the fishing boats, and the delivery trucks that came to certain businesses at odd hours. She collected public records: business licenses, property transfers, boat registrations. Everything was public information, available at the county clerk's office. She made copies of everything. She also started building a network of informants. Carefully, quietly, she reached out to other people in town who had been threatened or pressured by the organization. She didn't reveal the full scope of what she was doing, just asked questions, listened to stories, and documented everything. Many people were too frightened to talk. But a few, like Frank, were angry enough to help. They gave her names, dates, details about threats and coercion. Lorraine was careful never to write anything down in front of witnesses. She memorized information during conversations, then wrote it down later in her locked back room. She varied her routines, sometimes staying late at the bookstore, sometimes arriving early, so her patterns wouldn't be predictable. She continued running the book club, maintained her friendships, and acted like nothing had changed. Rick Miller and the other suspicious members still attended, and Lorraine treated them exactly as she always had: friendly, welcoming, giving no sign that she knew who they really were. It was exhausting. She had to maintain two completely separate identities: Lorraine the bookstore owner and Lorraine the investigator. One slip, one wrong word, and everything could fall apart. By mid-December, Lorraine had accumulated a significant amount of evidence. But she still needed something definitive: proof of actual criminal activity, not just suspicious behavior. She needed to catch them in the act. She spent a week surveilling the fishing boats. She learned their schedules, their patterns. Most nights, nothing unusual happened. But on certain nights, nights that corresponded with new moons, when the ocean was darkest, the boats would go out around midnight and return just before dawn. On December 20th, Lorraine decided to watch one of these late-night operations. It was risky. If anyone saw her, if anyone questioned what she was doing down at the docks at midnight, her cover would be blown. But she needed concrete evidence, and this was the only way to get it. She dressed in dark clothes, brought her camera, and drove to a vantage point overlooking the harbor. She parked her car a quarter-mile away and walked the rest of the distance, staying in the shadows. At 12:15 a.m., Vincent Costa's fishing boat fired up its engines and headed out to sea. Lorraine waited, crouched behind some rocks, her camera ready. The boat returned at 3:30 a.m. Through her telephoto lens, Lorraine watched as 3 men unloaded packages from the boat. They were wrapped in waterproof material, each about the size of a large brick. The packages were loaded into a waiting van. Lorraine photographed the license plate. Just as she was about to leave, she heard voices. 2 men were walking along the dock, their flashlights bobbing in the darkness. Lorraine pressed herself flat against the rocks, barely breathing. The men were close enough that she could hear their conversation. "Next shipment Tuesday? Costa says we need to move faster. Pressure from up north. Tell Morrison to stop whining and do his job." The men continued past her hiding spot. Lorraine stayed frozen for another 10 minutes, waiting until she was certain they were gone. When she finally made it back to her car, her hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from adrenaline and excitement. She had photographs of illegal activity. Real evidence. It was time to start planning the next phase. It was time to bring these criminals to justice. On a cold morning in early January, Lorraine sat in her living room with her laptop, staring at a list of names. These were FBI agents she had worked with during her time on the federal bench. Some had testified in her courtroom. Others she had met at judicial conferences or through professional connections. The question was, which one could she trust? It had been 12 years since she left Washington. Some of these agents would be retired by now. Others might have moved to different offices or different careers, and even among those who were still active, she needed someone who would take her seriously, who would act quickly and discreetly. Her eyes settled on one name: Special Agent Diane Chen, FBI, Portland Field Office. Chen had testified in Lorraine's court 8 years before Lorraine resigned. She had been a young agent then, maybe 30, but sharp and thorough. The case had been a complex bank fraud scheme, and Chen's investigation had been meticulous. Lorraine remembered being impressed by her attention to detail and her integrity. More importantly, Lorraine remembered something Chen had said during a recess in that trial. They had been in chambers, and Chen had mentioned that she grew up in a small Oregon coastal town. Towns like that, Chen had said, they seem quiet, but sometimes the worst crimes hide in quiet places because nobody thinks to look there. Lorraine checked the FBI website. Chen was now a senior special agent in the Portland Field Office, specializing in organized crime and financial crimes. Perfect. But she couldn't just call the FBI field office and ask for Agent Chen. Phone lines could be monitored. She needed to make contact carefully, privately. Lorraine spent the next week researching Chen's recent cases. She found several news articles about successful prosecutions Chen had led: drug trafficking rings, money laundering operations, corruption cases. She was exactly the kind of agent Lorraine needed. The challenge was making contact without alerting the criminal organization in Misty Vale. If Chen contacted the local sheriff's office as part of a routine investigation, Drake would immediately warn Morrison and the others. They would destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, and disappear. Lorraine needed to give Chen everything at once, a complete, overwhelming case that would force immediate action. So she kept investigating. Throughout January and February, Lorraine documented everything. She photographed every suspicious meeting. She collected every piece of public information about the new businesses, the fishing boats, and the people involved. She interviewed every person in Misty Vale who had been threatened or coerced, carefully recording their stories. She created a timeline of the organization's arrival in Misty Vale, showing how they systematically took control of the town's infrastructure. She documented the flow of money through the legitimate businesses, showing the obvious signs of money laundering. She built organizational charts, showing the hierarchy from the street-level couriers up through the local operators like Rick Miller, then to the leadership level with Morrison, Drake, and Costa. Every evening, after closing the bookstore, Lorraine worked in her locked back room, organizing evidence, writing analysis, building a case that would be impossible to dismiss or ignore. She also prepared for the possibility that the investigation might put her in danger. She made copies of all her evidence and stored them in 3 separate, secure locations: a safety deposit box in the next town over, a locked filing cabinet in the next town over, and a safe in the next town over cabinet at Sarah Winter's house. Sarah didn't know what was in the sealed box Lorraine had asked her to keep safe. and a cloud storage account under a pseudonym. If anything happened to Lorraine, if she disappeared or was threatened, the evidence would still exist. By March, she had compiled over 400 pages of documentation, hundreds of photographs, and testimony from 15 intimidated residents. It was time to make contact with Agent Chen. Lorraine crafted her approach carefully. She couldn't email, too easy to intercept. She couldn't call from her home or cell phone. Those might be monitored. Instead, she drove to Portland, 2.5 hours away, on the pretense of attending a booksellers' conference. She found a busy internet cafe, used one of their computers, and created a new anonymous email account. Then she sent a carefully worded message to the FBI's Portland field office, marked Urgent Attention S.A. Diane Chen. The message read, Agent Chen, you don't know me, but I once knew you professionally in the Ninth Circuit. I have information about a significant organized crime operation in rural Oregon. This involves corruption of local law enforcement, so contacting local authorities is not an option. The situation is urgent. I have substantial evidence, but I need to deliver it securely. If you are interested in pursuing this matter, please place a classified advertisement in the Portland Tribune personal section with the code phrase, looking for first edition Steinbeck. I will contact you with further instructions. Time is critical. Lives are at risk. She didn't sign it. She didn't give any identifying information. If Chen remembered her, and Lorraine thought she would, the reference to the Ninth Circuit would be enough to trigger her memory. Lorraine sent the email, cleared the browser history, and drove back to Misty Vale. Now she had to wait. 4 days later, Lorraine bought the Portland Tribune at the grocery store. She flipped to the classifieds, personal section. There it was, looking for first edition Steinbeck. Serious inquiries only. Call after 6 p.m. A phone number followed. Lorraine felt a surge of relief and anxiety. Chen had responded. Now came the hard part, actually making contact and handing over the evidence. That evening, Lorraine drove to a different town, found a payphone, one of the few remaining in rural Oregon, and called the number. Chen answered on the second ring. This is Diane. Agent Chen, this is the person who contacted you about the rural organized crime operation. There was a pause. I'm listening. I can't talk long. I have extensive evidence of drug trafficking, money laundering, and corruption of local officials in a small coastal town. The local sheriff is compromised, so the normal reporting channels won't work. What town? I'd rather not say over the phone. I need to meet with you in person and deliver the evidence. Can we arrange that? Where are you calling from right now? A payphone, 30 miles from my location. Smart. Chen's voice was businesslike but interested. How extensive is your evidence? Over 400 pages of documentation, hundreds of photographs, testimony from 15 witnesses, financial records, and surveillance footage. Another pause. That's substantial. Who are you? Someone who knows how to build a federal case. There was a long silence. Then Chen said, Judge Adams? Lorraine closed her eyes. Yes. Jesus, I heard you retired and disappeared. What are you doing investigating organized crime? It's a long story. Can we meet? Yes, but I need to be careful. If what you're saying is true, and local law enforcement is compromised, we can't risk anyone seeing us together. They arranged a meeting for the following week at a state park halfway between Portland and Misty Vale. Chen would come alone, in an unmarked personal vehicle. Lorraine would bring the evidence. As Lorraine hung up the phone, she felt a mixture of relief and trepidation. She was about to cross a line from which there was no return. Once she handed this evidence to the FBI, everything would change. The investigation would become official. There would be arrests, trials, media coverage. Her quiet life in Misty Vale would be over. But it didn't matter. She had spent 12 years running from her failure in Senator Webb's case. This was her chance to do things right, to see justice done, to protect innocent people from predators. She drove back toward Misty Vale, watching the sunset over the Pacific Ocean, and felt more certain than she had in years. This was what she was meant to do. The state park was called Silver Creek Falls, a popular tourist destination in the summer, but nearly empty on a chilly March afternoon. Lorraine arrived early and parked in the main lot. She had brought the evidence in 3 large accordion files, sealed in waterproof bags. At exactly 3 o'clock, a silver Honda pulled into the lot. A woman in jeans and a hiking jacket got out. She was in her early 40s now, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, but Lorraine recognized her immediately. Agent Diane Chen looked around the parking lot carefully, then walked toward Lorraine. "Judge Adams." "Just Lorraine now," Lorraine said, extending her hand. "Thank you for coming." "Let's walk," Chen said, gesturing toward one of the trails. They walked in silence for about 5 minutes, following a trail that led along a stream. When they were well away from the parking lot and satisfied that no one had followed them, Chen stopped. "All right, tell me everything." Lorraine started from the beginning. She explained how she had noticed suspicious patterns in Misty Vale, how she had begun investigating, what she had discovered. She outlined the structure of the criminal organization, the scope of their operations, and the corruption of local officials. Chen listened without interrupting, her face serious. When Lorraine finished, Chen said, "And you documented all of this?" "Everything." Lorraine handed over the 3 files. The first file is organizational structure and key personnel. The second is evidence of criminal activity, photographs, surveillance notes, witness statements. The third is financial documentation showing money laundering through local businesses. Chen opened the first file and began flipping through the pages. Her eyes widened as she saw the level of detail. "This is comprehensive. How long did this take you?" 4 months of intensive investigation, but I had noticed things for about 8 months before that. "You did this alone?" "Yes." Chen looked up from the file, studying Lorraine's face. "Why?" "You retired. You could have just reported your suspicions and walked away." Lorraine was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Because I failed once. In my last case as a judge, I let a guilty man go free because I was constrained by politics and procedure. It's haunted me for 12 years. This is my chance to do things right." Chen nodded slowly. "The Webb case. You know about it?" "Every federal agent knows about it. It was all over the news. For what it's worth, I thought you got a raw deal. You were put in an impossible situation. That doesn't excuse the result. Maybe not. But it explains why you're standing here now, handing me a federal case instead of living a quiet retirement." Chen closed the file and looked at Lorraine seriously. "You understand that this is going to blow up your life again, right? We're going to need you to testify. Your identity as the source will come out. You'll be in the media again. And if this organization has connections outside Misty Vale, which they probably do, you might be in danger." "I understand. There are 15 witnesses listed in here. Are they prepared to testify?" "Some are. Others are terrified. They'll need protection. We can provide that. But I need to be honest with you. This is going to take time. We can't just swoop in and arrest everyone tomorrow. I need to review all this evidence, verify it independently, and build our own case. The defense attorneys are going to scrutinize every detail. If there are any problems with how the evidence was collected, quote, "I know the rules," Lorraine said. "Everything I collected is legally obtained. Public records, photographs taken from public spaces, voluntary witness statements, nothing that would be excluded in court. Chen smiled slightly. Of course. You wrote the book on evidence admissibility. When can you move on this? I'll take this back to Portland today and start reviewing it tonight. If it's as solid as it looks, I'll assemble a task force. But I want to do this right. We'll probably need at least a month to verify everything and prepare for coordinated arrests. Can you maintain your cover that long? I think so. They don't suspect anything. I'm just the bookstore lady. Be careful. If they have any sense that someone is investigating them, they'll get dangerous. These people have already broken arms and threatened families. They won't hesitate to do worse. After leaving Chen, Lorraine drove back to Misty Vale with mixed feelings. Relief that she had finally handed off the evidence. Anxiety about the waiting period. Fear that something might go wrong. But also determination. She had done the right thing. Now she just had to maintain her cover for a little longer. The next few weeks were the most difficult of Lorraine's life. She had to act completely normal while knowing that a federal investigation was building around the town. She had to smile at Mayor Morrison when she saw him at the grocery store, had to wave to Sheriff Drake when he drove past the bookstore, had to sit in the same room with Rick Miller at book club meetings. Every day, she expected something to go wrong. She expected the criminals to suddenly flee town, or to discover that she was the informant, or to hurt someone else in the community. But nothing happened. Life in Misty Vale continued as normal, at least on the surface. In early April, Lorraine received a cryptic message. A customer came into the bookstore and asked for a book about silver creeks and waterfalls. Lorraine immediately recognized the code phrase she and Chen had arranged. She slipped the customer a note with a time and place. A different state park, 2 days from now. When she met Chen this time, the agent looked tired but excited. We've verified everything, Chen said. Your evidence is solid. We've conducted additional surveillance, gotten wiretap warrants, and built on what you started. We're ready to move. When? Next week, Wednesday, April 10th. We're going to hit them all at once. Coordinated arrests of Morrison, Drake, Costa, Miller, and 15 others. Federal agents from Portland, Eugene, and Medford. We'll also have DEA involvement because of the drug trafficking. What about the witnesses? The people who helped me? We'll have protective custody available for anyone who needs it. I've already arranged for safe houses. Frank Kowalski. He was threatened and injured. He needs protection. We'll take care of him. I promise. Chen looked at Lorraine seriously. When this goes down, you need to be safe too. I want you to leave town on Wednesday morning, before the arrests. Drive to Portland, check into a hotel under a false name. Stay there until we've secured the situation. I want to be there. When you arrest them. Absolutely not. You're a civilian and you're a potential witness. You can't be anywhere near the operational area. These are my neighbors, my community. I need to see this through. You will. But not that day. Let us do our job, and then you can come back and help your community recover. Lorraine wanted to argue, but she knew Chen was right. She had done her part. Now she had to let the professionals handle the rest. There's one more thing, Chen said. When this is over, when the arrests are made and the story comes out, the media is going to go crazy. Federal judge comes out of retirement to expose small-town crime ring. It's going to be everywhere. You need to be prepared for that. I know. Your quiet life is over. I know, Lorraine said again, but it's worth it. Chen reached out and squeezed Lorraine's shoulder. What you did here, building this case, protecting these people, bringing me solid evidence. This is extraordinary. You should be proud. As Lorraine drove home, she felt a strange sense of peace. The weight she had been carrying for 12 years, the weight of the Webb case, was finally lifting. She had found her redemption. The days leading up to April 10th felt surreal. Lorraine went through her normal routines, opening the bookstore, chatting with customers, attending town council meetings. But everything felt different now, charged with anticipation and dread. On Tuesday, April 9th, Lorraine stayed late at the bookstore, supposedly doing inventory. In reality, she was destroying any evidence that might link her to the investigation. She had already moved the copies of documents out of the back room. Now she was making sure there were no notes, no photographs, nothing that would indicate what she had been doing. She wanted to say goodbye to her friends, but she couldn't risk it. Margaret, Sarah, Frank, they would all understand eventually, but for now she had to disappear without explanation. At 6 a.m. on Wednesday, April 10th, Lorraine packed a small overnight bag, locked up her house, and drove out of Misty Vale. As she crested the hill and looked back at the town in her rearview mirror, she wondered what it would look like when she returned. She drove to Portland, checked into a hotel under the name Mary Sullivan, and waited. Chen had promised to call her when the operation was complete. The wait was agonizing. Lorraine couldn't focus on anything. She tried to read, but the words blurred on the page. She tried to watch television, but couldn't concentrate. She paced the hotel room, checking her phone every few minutes. At 11:30 a.m., her phone rang. "It's done," Chen said. "We arrested all primary targets without incident. Morrison, Drake, Costa, Miller, and 12 others. We also seized evidence from multiple locations: the fishing boats, several businesses, Morrison's home, Drake's office. We found drugs, cash, and documentation that corroborates everything you gave us." Lorraine felt tears spring to her eyes. "Anyone hurt?" "No. It was clean. The suspects were shocked. They clearly had no idea we were coming." "The witnesses? The people who helped me?" "All safe. We have protective details on Frank Kowalski and the others. No one will touch them." Lorraine sat down on the edge of the hotel bed. "Thank you. Thank you. This is going to be one of the biggest organized crime busts in Oregon history. And it's because of you." After hanging up with Chen, Lorraine turned on the television. Within an hour, the news broke. Every station had the same story. Massive federal operation breaks up rural Oregon crime ring. The footage showed FBI agents leading Mayor Morrison and Sheriff Drake out of their offices in handcuffs, boats being searched, evidence being carried out of buildings. By evening, the story had expanded. Investigative reporters were digging into the background, trying to understand how such a sophisticated criminal operation had established itself in a small town. And then, inevitably, they discovered Lorraine's role. Sources tell us that the investigation was initiated by a local resident who compiled evidence over several months and brought it to federal authorities. That resident has been identified as Lorraine Adams, owner of a local bookstore. But Adams is not just a bookstore owner. She is also a former federal judge who resigned 12 years ago in a controversial case involving Senator Marcus Webb. The story exploded. Judge comes out of retirement to fight crime. Former Judge Adams finds redemption in small-town bust. From courtroom to crime fighting. The Lorraine Adams story. Lorraine's phone rang continuously. Reporters wanted interviews. Old colleagues wanted to congratulate her. Emma called, worried and proud at the same time. For 3 days, Lorraine stayed in the Portland hotel, avoiding the media circus. But on Saturday, Chen called again. "You should come home," the agent said. "Misty Vale wants to see you." "Are you sure? They might hate me for bringing this chaos into their lives." "Trust me, come home." On Sunday morning, Lorraine drove back to Misty Vale. As she approached the town, she saw that the FBI vehicles were gone, but there were news vans parked along Main Street. She drove past them, ignoring the reporters who rushed toward her car and parked behind her bookstore. Margaret was waiting at the back door. "Lorraine," Margaret said, pulling her into a hug. "We were so worried about you." "I'm sorry I disappeared without telling you. Don't apologize. We understand now. We all understand." Margaret led her inside. The bookstore was full of people. Sarah was there, and Frank, his arm still in a cast, and dozens of other Misty Vale residents. When Lorraine walked in, they began to applaud. Lorraine stood frozen, overwhelmed. Frank stepped forward. "You saved us," he said simply. "All of us. We were too scared to fight back. But you weren't." "I'm sorry I kept you in the dark," Lorraine said to the crowd. "I couldn't risk anyone knowing what I was doing." "You were a judge?" Sarah asked. "A federal judge?" "A long time ago." "Why didn't you tell us?" "Because I wanted to be someone different. I wanted to leave that life behind. But when I saw what was happening here, I couldn't stay silent." Over the next hour, Lorraine told them the whole story. She told them about the Webb case, about her resignation, about coming to Misty Vale to escape her past. She told them about the investigation, about collecting evidence, about contacting the FBI. They listened in silence. When she finished, Margaret said, "You gave up your quiet life to help us." "I had to. This is my home. You're my family." "What happens now?" someone asked. "Now," Lorraine said, "we rebuild. Morrison and Drake and the others will go to prison. The businesses they controlled will need new owners. The people they threatened can live without fear. Misty Vale can be what it's supposed to be. A good place, a safe place. And you?" Frank asked. "Will you stay?" Lorraine looked around the bookstore at the faces of people she had come to love. "If you'll have me, despite all the chaos I've brought." "You didn't bring chaos," Sarah said firmly. "You stopped it." "There's a difference." The media attention was intense, but brief. For 2 weeks, reporters camped out in Misty Vale, interviewing residents, filming the town, trying to understand how a retired federal judge had become a small-town investigator. Lorraine gave one press conference, standing in front of the reading nook with Agent Chen beside her. She kept it brief. "What happened in Misty Vale is not unique," she said to the cameras. "Criminal organizations prey on small communities because they think no one is watching. They rely on fear and isolation to maintain control. But communities are stronger than they know. The people of Misty Vale were victims, but they're also survivors. They helped me gather evidence even when they were afraid. They deserve the credit for what happened here." A reporter shouted a question. "Judge Adams, do you regret your decision in the Webb case?" Lorraine looked directly at the camera. "Every day. But I can't change the past. I can only try to do better going forward. I failed to protect people once. I won't make that mistake again." After the press conference, the reporters gradually left. Without new developments, the story faded from the news cycle. Misty Vale returned to its normal rhythm, though forever changed. The trials began in the summer. Mayor Morrison, Sheriff Drake, Vincent Costa, and 15 others were charged with an array of federal crimes: drug trafficking, money laundering, racketeering, extortion, and assault. The evidence Lorraine had collected, combined with the FBI's additional investigation, built an overwhelming case. Lorraine testified at several of the trials. Walking into a federal courtroom again, 12 years after walking out of one, felt surreal. But this time was different. This time, she was fighting for justice, not being constrained by it. The defense attorneys tried to discredit her, suggesting that she had conducted an illegal investigation, that she had manufactured evidence, that she was seeking publicity to restore her reputation. But the evidence spoke for itself. Photographs, documents, witness testimony, all of it was independently verifiable and legally obtained. By fall, all the defendants had been convicted. Morrison received 15 years in federal prison. Drake got 12. Costa and the others received sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years. Frank Kowalski, watching the sentencing from the courtroom gallery, said to Lorraine, "Justice." Finally. Lorraine nodded, but she felt no triumph, only relief. Justice wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about accountability and protection. These men could no longer hurt anyone. The people of Misty Vale could sleep safely. As the legal proceedings wound down, Misty Vale began the process of recovery and reform. The town held a special election for a new mayor. They elected Emily Rodriguez, the art gallery owner, a longtime resident known for her integrity and community involvement. The county appointed a temporary sheriff until they could hold proper elections. The new sheriff, Carla Mendez, came from the state police with a reputation for honesty and competence. The businesses that had been fronts for money laundering were sold to legitimate owners. Several longtime residents bought them, determined to restore their town's character. The reading nook thrived. Lorraine's book club meetings now regularly drew 30 or 40 people. She added a second weekly meeting to accommodate demand. She also started a free legal advice clinic on Saturday mornings, using her legal expertise to help residents with simple matters, tenant disputes, contract questions, small claims issues. People still called her Lorraine, not Judge Adams. But there was a new respect in their voices, a recognition of who she really was. In November, on a foggy evening that reminded Lorraine of her first visit to Misty Vale, Margaret brought over coffee and sat with Lorraine in the bookstore after closing. "Can I ask you something?" Margaret said. "Of course. That case, the one with Senator Webb, do you still think about it?" Lorraine was quiet for a moment. "Yes, but differently now. For years, I thought of it as my great failure, the moment I betrayed everything I believed in. But I've realized something. I didn't betray my beliefs. I was forced into an impossible choice, and I made the decision I thought was right at the time. I can regret the outcome without condemning myself for the choice." "That sounds like you've forgiven yourself. Maybe. Or at least I've accepted that I'm human. Judges are supposed to be perfect, impartial, above human weakness. But we're not. We're people, trying to do our best in complicated situations. What you did here, exposing the crime ring, was that about redemption?" Lorraine thought about it. "At first, maybe. But it became about something more important. It was about protecting people I care about using whatever skills and knowledge I have to make things better. That's what I should have been doing all along, not worrying about my reputation or my career." Margaret smiled. "You know what I think? I think you were always meant to end up here. Not as a federal judge in Washington, but as Lorraine, the bookstore owner in Misty Vale. This is where you belong." After Margaret left, Lorraine stood at the window of her bookstore, looking out at Main Street. The fog was rolling in from the ocean, obscuring the buildings in a gray mist. It looked exactly like it had 12 years ago when she first arrived, running from her past. But she wasn't running anymore. She thought about her 23 years on the federal bench, the thousands of cases she had presided over, the lives she had affected. She had been a good judge, for the most part. She had been fair, thorough, and committed to justice. But in the end, the system had broken her. Or rather, it had revealed its own brokenness, and she hadn't been able to bear being part of it. Here in Misty Vale, in this small bookstore, she had found a different kind of justice. Not the formal procedural justice of courtrooms and legal briefs, but the practical personal justice of protecting your neighbors, standing up to bullies, and refusing to let fear win. She had spent 12 years building a quiet life. Then she had spent 4 months risking that life to save her community. And in doing so, she had finally made peace with her past. Senator Webb was still free. That injustice still existed in the world. She couldn't change it. But Morrison, Drake, and the others were in prison. 15 families in Misty Vale could live without fear. Frank Kowalski could fish in peace. The young people who had been coerced into criminal activity had been given a second chance through plea deals and rehabilitation programs. That was justice. Imperfect, incomplete, but real. Lorraine locked up the bookstore and walked home through the fog. Her house was small and weathered, but it was warm and comfortable. She made tea, sat in her favorite chair by the window, and opened a mystery novel. The price of justice, she had learned, was not measured in prestige or success. It was measured in courage, conviction, and the willingness to do what was right even when it was hard. She had paid that price. And she had found something better than redemption. She had found peace. By the spring of 2025, Misty Vale had settled into a new normal. The trauma of the criminal organization's presence had faded, replaced by a renewed sense of community and purpose. Lorraine continued running the Reading Nook, but her role in the town had expanded. She was now serving on the town council, elected by unanimous vote after Emily Rodriguez insisted she run. She had been reluctant at first, wary of returning to public life, but Margaret had convinced her. "It's not about being a public figure," Margaret had said. "It's about using your knowledge to help the town. We need someone who understands law and government. That's you." So Lorraine attended the monthly council meetings, helped draft new ordinances to protect against future corruption, and advised on legal matters. It was a far cry from the federal bench, but in many ways, it was more satisfying. She could see the direct impact of her work on people's lives. The book club had become an institution. On a Tuesday evening in April, 43 people packed into the bookstore's back room for the discussion of The Great Gatsby. Lorraine had to bring in extra chairs. The discussions were always lively. Sarah led the literary analysis, pointing out symbolism and themes. Frank offered historical context about the 1920s. Others shared personal reactions and connections. Lorraine mostly listened, guiding the conversation when it veered off track, but letting the participants drive the discussion. She loved seeing people discover literature, debate interpretations, and connect over shared love of books. After the meeting, as people were leaving, a young woman approached Lorraine hesitantly. "Miss Adams? I'm Rachel Cooper. I just moved to Misty Vale last month." "Welcome. I hope you enjoyed the discussion." "I did. But I actually wanted to talk to you about something else. I heard about what you did, exposing the crime ring. And I wanted you to know, you inspired me." "Inspired you how?" Rachel looked embarrassed. "This is going to sound weird, but I'm a paralegal. I've been working for a firm in Portland, and I've seen some things that I think might be illegal. I've been too scared to report it. But hearing your story, how you stood up even when it was risky, it made me realize I need to do the same." Lorraine felt a surge of emotion. "Tell me more." They talked for an hour. Rachel explained the situation. Her firm was representing a corporation that appeared to be engaging in environmental fraud, falsifying documents to hide toxic waste disposal. Rachel had discovered the evidence by accident and had been agonizing about what to do. "I could lose my job," she said. "I could get blacklisted in the legal community. But if I don't report this, People could get hurt. There's a residential area near the waste site. Lorraine remembered her own crisis of conscience, standing in her chambers 12 years ago, trying to decide between her career and her principles. If you report this, you will face consequences, Lorraine said honestly. But if you don't report it, you'll face consequences too. Guilt, regret, knowing you could have stopped something wrong but chose not to. I lived with that for 12 years. It's not worth it. How did you finally move past it? By doing the right thing the next time I had the chance. You don't have to wait 12 years like I did. You can do the right thing now. They talked about practical steps, documenting the evidence, finding the right regulatory agency to contact, protecting herself legally. Lorraine gave her the names of attorneys who specialized in whistleblower protection. When Rachel left, she looked more confident, more determined. Lorraine stood in the empty bookstore, feeling a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. This was what justice looked like in real life. Not grand courtroom victories, but ordinary people finding the courage to do the right thing. A few days later, Emma visited from Seattle. She came down every few months now, staying for long weekends, helping at the bookstore, and walking on the beach with her mother. They were in Lorraine's kitchen, making dinner together, when Emma said, "Mom, I'm proud of you." For what? For everything. For starting over here. For doing the investigation. For staying even after everything came out. You could have run again, hidden somewhere else, but you didn't. This is my home now. These people are my family. I couldn't leave them. Do you miss it? The federal bench? Lorraine thought about it. I miss the intellectual challenge sometimes, the complex legal questions, the careful analysis. But I don't miss the politics, the pressure, the sense that justice was always being compromised by other considerations. Do you think you'll ever go back? To law in some way? I am doing law. The legal clinic at the bookstore helps people every week. Advising the town council on ordinances is legal work. What I did to bring down Morrison and Drake was essentially building a legal case. I'm still practicing law, just in a different form. Emma smiled. Judge Adams, bookstore edition. I prefer Lorraine, community member. That weekend, Misty Vale held its annual spring festival. Main Street was closed to traffic and filled with booths selling local crafts, food, and art. There was live music, activities for children, and a general atmosphere of celebration. Lorraine helped Margaret set up a booth for the coffee shop. As they worked, Frank wandered over with Sarah. Can you believe this is the same town that was under criminal control a year ago? Frank said, looking around at the crowds. People are resilient, Lorraine said. They were waiting for a chance to take their town back. We never would have had that chance without you, Sarah said. I couldn't have done it without all of you. Every person who talked to me, who shared information, who trusted me, that's what made the difference. Mayor Emily Rodriguez stopped by the booth. Lorraine, we need you at the council meeting next week. We're discussing the new community center proposal. I'll be there. We need you to present the legal framework for the funding structure. You're the only one who understands the tax implications. Lorraine laughed. All right, I'll prepare something. As the day went on, Lorraine found herself talking with dozens of people, old friends, new residents, tourists visiting for the festival. Each conversation reminded her of how much she loved this community, this place she had stumbled into 12 years ago while running from her past. That evening, as the festival wound down and the sun set over the Pacific, Lorraine sat on a bench overlooking the ocean. The fog was rolling in, as it always did, painting the world in shades of gray. She thought about the girl she had been 50 years ago, passionate about law, convinced that the legal system was the ultimate tool for justice. She thought about the judge she had become, successful and respected, but ultimately constrained by a system that valued power over truth. And she thought about the person she was now, a bookstore owner, a community member, someone who had learned that justice came in many forms. The formal justice system was important. Courts, trials, legal procedures, they mattered, but they weren't everything. Sometimes justice was an old fisherman being able to live without fear. Sometimes it was a young paralegal finding the courage to report fraud. Sometimes it was a small town reclaiming its identity from criminals. Sometimes justice was simply being there for people who needed help. Lorraine watched the waves crash against the rocks below. Somewhere out there in the world, there was still injustice. Senator Webb was still free. Other criminals were still preying on vulnerable people. The legal system was still imperfect, still vulnerable to manipulation and corruption. She couldn't fix all of it, but she could fix some of it. She could protect her community. She could help people who came to her for advice. She could inspire others, like Rachel, to stand up for what was right. That was enough. No, Lorraine thought, standing up and brushing off her jeans. It was more than enough. It was everything. In June, Lorraine received an unexpected phone call from Washington, D.C. Judge Adams, this is Senator Elizabeth Martinez. Do you have a few minutes to talk? Lorraine recognized the name. Martinez was chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, known for her integrity and her efforts to reform the federal judicial system. Senator, I'm not a judge anymore. Just Lorraine. Well, Lorraine, I wanted to talk to you about something important. We're holding hearings on judicial independence and political pressure in federal courts. Your case, the Webb dismissal, has become a focal point of our investigation. We'd like you to testify. Lorraine felt her stomach tighten. I don't think reopening that case serves any purpose. It's done. It's not about reopening the case. It's about preventing future cases like it. We have evidence that the administrative memorandum you were forced to follow was created specifically to protect Webb. There was a coordinated effort involving multiple branches of government to manipulate your courtroom. We want to expose that and create safeguards to prevent it from happening again. Senator Webb is still a senator. He's still powerful. Testifying against him would be... Webb resigned last month. He's facing state-level corruption charges in California. His protection has evaporated. Lorraine absorbed this information. Webb resigned. His political career was over. What would you want me to testify about? The pressure you faced. The mechanisms that were used to compromise your independence as a judge. How you were placed in an impossible position. Your testimony could help us create reforms that protect other judges from similar situations. Lorraine walked to her bookstore window, looking out at Main Street. She had built a good life here, far from Washington and politics and federal cases. Did she really want to return to that world, even briefly? But then she thought about other judges, current and future, who might face the same impossible choices she had faced. If her testimony could help prevent that, didn't she have an obligation to give it? When are the hearings? She asked. Next month, July 15th. We would cover all your travel expenses and provide security if needed. Let me think about it. I'll call you back in a few days. After hanging up, Lorraine sat at her desk in the bookstore's back room, now converted from investigation headquarters back into a simple office. She pulled out a legal pad and started making notes. If she testified, what would she say? What was important to convey? She wrote for an hour, organizing her thoughts, remembering the details of that terrible March day 12 years ago when she had dismissed the Webb case. That evening, she called Emma. "Mom, you should do it," Emma said immediately. "This is your chance to fix what went wrong." "I can't fix it. Webb got away with his crimes." but you can help prevent the same thing from happening to other judges. That's fixing the system, even if you can't change that specific case. It means going back to Washington, facing the media again, reliving the worst moment of my career. You've already faced harder things. You took down a criminal organization. Testifying before Congress should be easy compared to that. Lorraine laughed despite herself. When did you become so wise? I had a good teacher. Lorraine also called Agent Chen, who had become a friend over the past year. Do it, Chen said firmly. Your story needs to be told. Not for you, but for the system. We can't fix institutional problems if people aren't willing to talk about them. Finally, Lorraine called Margaret, Sarah, and Frank and invited them to dinner at her house. She explained the situation and asked for their advice. What do you want to do? Margaret asked. Part of me wants to say no, to stay here, keep my quiet life, and forget about Washington and politics. And the other part? The other part thinks I owe it to the system that I served for 23 years. I can't fix my own case, but maybe I can help prevent future cases like it. Frank, who had been quiet, spoke up. You taught us something important this past year. You taught us that when you see something wrong, you don't hide from it. You face it, even when it's hard, even when it's scary. If you believe testifying will help prevent other judges from being trapped the way you were, then you should do it. But I don't want to leave Misty Vale. This is my home. We're not asking you to leave, Sarah said. We're asking you to go to Washington, tell your truth, and come back home. This place will be here. We'll be here. A week later, Lorraine called Senator Martinez and agreed to testify. On July 14th, Lorraine flew to Washington, D.C. for the first time in 12 years. The city looked different. New buildings, new monuments, but also familiar. The weight of history and power that permeated every street corner hadn't changed. She stayed in a hotel near Capitol Hill and spent the evening preparing her testimony. Senator Martinez's staff had sent her questions she would likely be asked, and Lorraine worked on her responses, trying to balance honesty with precision. The next morning, she dressed in a simple navy suit, professional but not flashy, and took a taxi to the Capitol. The hearing room was packed. Cameras lined the back wall. Senators sat at a raised bench. Reporters filled the gallery. Lorraine recognized some faces from her years on the bench, colleagues, attorneys, legal scholars. Senator Martinez called the hearing to order and introduced Lorraine. Our first witness today is Lorraine Adams, former federal judge in the Ninth Circuit. Judge Adams presided over United States versus Marcus Webb, a case that has become central to our investigation of political interference in federal courts. Judge Adams resigned following that case and subsequently relocated to rural Oregon, where she recently made headlines for a different reason, leading an investigation that exposed a criminal organization operating in her community. Judge Adams, thank you for being here. Lorraine was sworn in and began her testimony. She talked about her career on the bench, her commitment to justice, her belief in the rule of law. She explained the Webb case, the clear evidence of guilt, the political pressure she faced, the impossible choice created by the administrative memorandum. I understood, she said, looking directly at the senators, that I was being given an option. Dismiss the case and keep my career, or refuse to dismiss and face removal from the bench and inevitable reversal on appeal anyway. Either way, Senator Webb would go free. The only variable was whether my career would survive. What did you do? Senator Martinez asked. I dismissed the case. I followed the procedural requirements, and I hated myself for it. Why? Because I knew it was wrong. I knew that a guilty man was escaping justice because of political manipulation of the legal system, and I knew that I was complicit in that manipulation by following procedures that were designed specifically to protect him. but you had no real choice. I had a choice. I could have refused. I could have forced them to remove me from the bench, to make their corruption visible. Instead, I took the quiet option, the procedural option, the one that let everyone pretend the system was working as intended. The hearing room was absolutely silent. For 12 years, Lorraine continued, I have lived with that decision. I left the bench because I couldn't continue to be part of a system that could be so easily corrupted. I moved to a small town and tried to forget who I had been, what I had lost. But you didn't forget. No. And when I saw criminal activity in my community, when I saw people being threatened and coerced, I couldn't stand by. I investigated. I gathered evidence. I brought it to federal law enforcement because I had failed once to protect innocent people, and I was determined not to fail again. Senator Martinez leaned forward. What do you think needs to change in our federal judicial system to prevent future cases like yours? Lorraine had prepared for this question. 3 things. First, administrative procedures affecting judicial processes should be subject to public comment and review, not issued by executive fiat. Second, there should be clear protections for judges who resist political pressure, including expedited appeals to higher courts and whistleblower protections. Third, any attempt to pressure or manipulate a judge should be treated as a criminal offense with serious penalties. For 2 hours, Lorraine answered questions from senators of both parties. Some were sympathetic, others skeptical. Some wanted to use her testimony to criticize their political opponents. Others wanted to defend the existing system. But Lorraine refused to be political. She focused on the structural problems, the mechanisms that had been used to compromise her independence, and the reforms that could prevent future abuses. When the hearing finally ended, Senator Martinez thanked her. Your testimony today was powerful and important, the senator said privately afterward. It took courage to come here and revisit this. Will anything actually change? Lorraine asked. I hope so. We're proposing legislation based on these hearings. Whether it passes will depend on many factors, but you've given us a foundation to work from. That evening, Lorraine had dinner with Agent Chen. How did it feel? Chen asked. Being back in that world? Strange. Like visiting a place you used to live but don't anymore. I recognized everything, but it didn't feel like home. Does Misty Vale feel like home? Yes, more than anywhere else ever has. They talked about the case against Morrison and Drake, which was now in the appeals stage but expected to be upheld. They talked about Misty Vale's recovery and rebuilding. They talked about the ripple effects of Lorraine's investigation, how it had inspired other small communities to look more carefully at corruption and organized crime. You started something bigger than you know, Chen said. Other cases have been opened based on your model of documentation and evidence collection. You created a template for how ordinary citizens can fight back against organized crime. The next morning, Lorraine flew back to Oregon. As the plane descended into Portland, she looked out the window at the green forests and the distant ocean and felt a sense of relief. She was going home. When she arrived back in Misty Vale that evening, Margaret, Sarah, and Frank were waiting at her house with dinner prepared. How was Washington? Margaret asked. Necessary, Lorraine said, but I'm glad to be back. They ate and talked and laughed, and Lorraine felt the tension of the past few days drain away. This was where she belonged. Not in courtrooms or hearing rooms, but here, with friends, in a community she loved. Later that night, alone in her house, Lorraine sat by the window and looked out at the ocean. The fog was rolling in, obscuring the horizon, turning the world soft and gray. She thought about the long, strange journey that had brought her here. From ambitious young lawyer to federal prosecutor to respected judge to failed jurist to small-town bookstore owner to accidental investigator to congressional witness. What a strange, imperfect, beautiful life. She had made mistakes, big ones. She had failed in the Webb case, failed to protect the victims, failed to stand up to the pressure when it mattered most. But she had also learned from those mistakes. She had found redemption not through grand gestures, but through small, daily choices to do the right thing, to help her neighbors, to stand up to bullies, to use whatever skills and knowledge she had to make her corner of the world a little better. That was enough. That was everything. Tomorrow, she would open the bookstore at 9. She would help customers find books. She would prepare for Tuesday's book club meeting. She would work on her presentation for the town council. She would live her life, simply and fully, in Misty Vale, Oregon. Judge Lorraine Adams had found her place in the world, and she was finally, truly at peace. 3 years later, the morning sun broke through the fog as Lorraine Adams opened the Reading Nook on a Tuesday in October 2028. She was 70 years old now, her hair completely gray, her movements a bit slower, but her mind as sharp as ever. The bookstore had expanded. She had bought the adjacent space when the old hardware store retired, doubling her floor space. Half was still books, new and used, carefully organized by genre and alphabetized by author. The other half was a community space with comfortable seating, a small coffee bar, run in partnership with Margaret, and walls covered with local art. The book club now met twice a week to accommodate the 50 regular members. There was also a teen book club, a writing group, and a monthly legal clinic that Lorraine ran with volunteer attorneys from Portland. Frank Kowalski came in at his usual time, 9:30 on Tuesday morning, ready to browse the history section. "Morning, Lorraine. Big news?" "What's that?" "Senator Martinez's judicial reform bill passed yesterday, signed into law this morning." Lorraine felt a surge of emotion. 3 years after her testimony, the reforms she had advocated for were finally law. Federal judges would have new protections against political pressure. Administrative procedures affecting judicial independence would require public comment. Attempts to manipulate judges would be federal crimes. It wouldn't prevent every abuse. Nothing could do that, but it was progress. "The bill is being called the Adams Act," Frank added, grinning. "Oh, no." "Oh, yes, you're officially in the history books now." After Frank left, Lorraine sat behind the counter, absorbing this news, her name on a federal law. It felt surreal, but more importantly, other judges wouldn't face what she had faced. That was what mattered. The morning passed quietly. Around 11, a young woman walked in, looking around uncertainly. "Can I help you?" Lorraine asked. "Are you Lorraine Adams?" "I am. I'm Jamie Rodriguez. I grew up here in Misty Vale. You probably don't remember me, but I used to come to your bookstore when I was a kid, back when the criminal organization was operating here." Lorraine looked closer. "Emily's daughter?" "Son, actually. I transitioned a few years ago. Changed my name. Jamie. Of course, I'm sorry I didn't recognize you. You look wonderful." Jamie smiled. "Thank you. I wanted to tell you something. What you did here, exposing the crime ring, it saved my life. Literally. I was being recruited by them. They had leverage on me. I was questioning my gender identity, and they found out. They were going to expose me unless I worked for them." Lorraine felt a chill. She had never known about this. "When the FBI raided, when everyone was arrested, I was freed from that threat. I could figure out who I really was without blackmail hanging over me. I wanted to thank you. I had no idea you were in danger. A lot of people were in danger. You saved more than you know." After Jamie left, Lorraine stood at the bookstore window, looking out at Misty Vale. How many other stories like Jamie's were there? How many lives had been affected by what happened 3 years ago? She would never know the full impact. But she knew it was real. That evening, Lorraine closed the bookstore and walked down to the beach. It was a beautiful autumn night, clear and crisp, the stars brilliant overhead. She thought about her life, all 70 years of it, the struggles and failures, the successes and redemptions, the career she had lost and the home she had found, the reputation she had damaged and slowly rebuilt. She thought about justice, not the abstract, idealized justice she had believed in as a young lawyer, but the real, complicated, imperfect justice that existed in the world. The justice that was messy and incomplete, but still worth fighting for. She thought about the Webb case, which would always be part of her story. She had failed that day. But she had learned from the failure, and she had made sure that failure led to something better. 3 years ago, standing on this same beach after the arrests, Lorraine had thought she had found peace. She had been right, but she hadn't understood how that peace would continue to grow and deepen as she continued to do the work she was meant to do. She wasn't done yet. There was more to do, more book clubs to facilitate, more legal advice to give, more young people to inspire, more work on the town council, more ways to serve her community. The price of justice, she had learned, wasn't paid once and forgotten. It was paid continuously, in small daily choices, in the decision to show up and do the work even when it was hard. She was willing to pay that price. She would always be willing to pay it. As Lorraine walked back to her house, she passed the reading nook. Through the window, she could see the interior, warm and inviting, shelves full of books, comfortable chairs waiting for tomorrow's customers. 12 years ago, she had bought this place to hide from her past. Now it was the center of her present and her future. Not just a bookstore, but a symbol of what she had learned about justice, community, and redemption. Lorraine Adams, former federal judge, had finally found where she belonged. And she had learned that justice wasn't something that happened in courtrooms or hearing rooms, though those places mattered. Justice was something you built, day by day, in the place you called home, with the people you called family. It was imperfect. It was incomplete. But it was real. And it was enough. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.